Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
We welcome you today to another roundtable discussion of the Doctrine and Covenants. We have gathered today professors from the Church History and Doctrine Department at Brigham Young University. Across the table from me is Craig Mansell. Welcome, Craig.
Pleased to be here.
Randy Bott. Welcome, Randy.
It's good to be here, Matt.
And Richard Cowan. It's nice to have you here, Richard.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
And I'm Matthew Richardson, Associate Dean of Religious Education. Today we'll begin our study of the Doctrine and Covenants with Section 77. Brethren, I'm excited about this block that we're doing. There's a lot to cover, as usual, and it's a fun opportunity to look and see what the Lord is trying to reveal not only to the saints in the past, but us today. We start off with Section 77, which has a little different format than most of our sections, a question and answer series of 15 questions and answers. And I thought it might be nice if we at least frame the context with a little bit of background so that we can set that as we jump in to start to study. And Richard, would you mind just setting the tone for us and the background for Section 77?
Well, early on, I guess it was about the time the church is organized, the Lord had given Joseph Smith the assignment to go through the Scriptures and prepare what we have come to call the Joseph Smith translation, or inspired version, it used to be called sometimes. But anyway, to go through and by revelation clarify the meaning of the Scriptures. And in the process of doing this, the brethren came to the book of Revelation, and like all of us, they had questions about it. But unlike us, they had the prophet to inquire of the Lord directly to understand the meaning of certain verses. And so that's what we have here, a series of questions and answers, which are really helpful. I just recently gave a series of talks on the book of Revelation, and the prophet's answers were very useful. I just wish he had asked a few more questions.
I like how you said they're very helpful. As a matter of fact, in an 1840 copy of the Doctrine and Covenants, Willard Richards penned in, he wrote in that this was a key to the revelation of John. And then Hiram Smith, Elder Hiram Smith, commented that it's a very small part of the house, the key. It opens the door for study. And so this isn't meant to be the only thing we should study from the book of Revelation, but that opening of the door. Mm-hmm. Craig, what's your thought when it comes to the key notion? I know we talked a little bit about that before.
Well, it unlocks gives us an opportunity to see what was going on in John's day through Joseph Smith's revelatory eye. He's speaking about these 7 churches of Asia. John is from the Isle of Patmos with the book of Revelations. But these are just question answers jutting in and out of the book of Revelations, not comprehensive, but they are some of the questions the brethren didn't have answers to. And that's why it's a key. It unlocks, and we have to walk through the door in order to explore more what Joseph was thinking with these answers to the questions.
Great. Well, let's jump into the text. When we see the questions coming almost in rapid fire succession, or at least it seems that way, the way the text is outlined here. And bing, one right after another. Where's a good place to start on this one? Randy, where should we jump in?
Oh, there's so much. I think we'll defer on question and answer on verse 1 until section 130, where it deals more with the sea of glass.
You know, this is a good point. I started to interrupt on this one, but there's so many things that we're bringing up here that we'll find is expounded upon in later sections as well. So it's not so much even as skipping as we see an expansion in later times. So
right.
Good point.
But in verse 2, the question is asked, what are we to understand by the 4 beasts spoken of in the same verse, which happened to be Revelation 4 and 6. And his answer was that the things which are in heaven have a likeness of those things that are on the earth, the spiritual being in the likeness of the temporal, and the temporal being in the likeness of the spiritual, which I think is interesting. That we don't want to carry that too far, but that the likeness of man you would be able to recognize as having 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a mouth, that your spirit body would resemble your physical body. It wouldn't be an exact mirror image necessarily, but it would at least resemble, as well as the spirit of the beast are the same way.
Good.
And we often look at the phenocharacteristics, and so our students want to say, well, does my phenocharacteristics, the outside of how I look, does my spirit mirror it exactly? And the word likeness then is the key word, isn't it, to come off? It's a likeness of man.
Good, good. Let's jump over into verse 7 on a question. What are we to understand by the 7 seals which was sealed? Richard, any thoughts on that?
Well, the answer is that, well, first of all, verse 6, it said that John had seen a scroll or a book with 7 seals. You know, just think of rolling something up and putting pieces of tape on it to keep it from unrolling. But the Lord in verse 7 said that each of those represented 1,000 years of the earth's temporal existence. And it's interesting as you read in the book of Revelation to see how just the brief snippets that we get from each of those 1,000-year periods can be related to key events that we see in the Scriptures. But I think we need to be careful. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, all you need to do in order to pinpoint the time of the Lord's second coming is to determine the exact moment of the fall and add 6,000 years.
Good luck in doing that.
Yeah.
The exact moment of the fall.
Well, yeah, but some people think that
That's
they
right.
can, and of course, if we look in our own Bible chronologies, they always say dates are only approximate, and we need to remember that we cannot pinpoint the time of the fall, nor have calendars been untampered since that time. And then if we skip down to verse 12, notice how the question is, what is meant by the opening of the 7th seal, meaning the 7th one of these 1,000-year periods? And the answer is that in the beginning of the 7th 1,000 years, we complete preparation for the coming of the Lord. You know, it doesn't say that at the moment that the 7,000 years begin, the Lord will appear, because then the next verse confirms that when the prophet asks, well, what's going to happen, when will events in a certain chapter in Revelation occur? And the answer is after the opening of the 7th seal, but before the Lord comes. So I just think that all that indicates that we don't know precisely. And there are many scriptures, and on the BYU campus, in recent times, I've heard at least 2 of the members of the 12 say, we don't know when the second coming is going to occur. And if we don't know, we don't think anyone else on earth does.
Well, I think this fits very nicely within the whole theme of what's happening with the Doctrine and Covenants from section 1 of the preface all the way to where we're at now is preparation.
Exactly.
I don't think our Father in heaven is meaning to be coy. I don't think he's trying to be secretive, but there's no doubt about it is prepare ye for the time. Not so much when it is, but be prepared whenever that is. I used to always think of it as not just when he comes, but when I come to him. I must be prepared whenever that might be. Randy?
But I think we would all agree that that the fact that he puts in there the fact that it's 7,000 years means that it's not going to continue on and endlessly on.
Right.
That there is a fixed time schedule, even though we may not know the beginning point. Nor the ending point there, but there is a certain sense of urgency in preparing, of gathering, and not deferring until the sign of the Son, coming of the Son of Man appears.
And that God does work by order. This isn't like a helter-skelter experience.
Let me add in that line, I have a quote by Orson F. Whitney with regards to the 7 seals. He says, "The book which John saw represented the real history of the world, what the eye of God has seen." So John is telling us here that the curtain's been pulled back, and he's been able to see these, these 7 seals or these 1,000-year spans, if that what they be. It's a unique opportunity that he's seen the beginning from the end, and that's a marvelous blessing to know that there's a plan, there's a beginning, and an end to it. He has seen it. A real history of the world. It exists.
Good. Why don't we jump over and let's take a look at perhaps over in verse 11. What are we to understand by the sealing of 144,000 out of all the tribes of Israel, 12,000 out of every tribe? And I think this is a great question. I hear this quite often. Any thoughts on this one? 144,000.
Well, he says that they are high priests. And again, it could be a temptation to say, well, let's just watch the annual reports of the church, and when we get to 144,000 high priests, then we know that that's the time for the second coming. Well, we've already passed that mark. All he says is that there will be 144,000 high priests chosen for this special assignment to prepare the way for the second coming.
I like where it says, in the answer to verse 11, to administer the everlasting gospel, to prepare through administration of the gospel.
And they will come out of every nation. So the idea of taking the gospel to all nations and then the church being established and high priests, so out of every nation will they come.
It's exciting to see it happening now.
Yes, the unfolding.
There's another point there. He also says that they were ordained unto the holy order of God by the angels to whom is given power over the nations of the earth. Now, an angel can be both a person, from the other side of the veil, but also a missionary or a person that is taking the gospel could also be interpreted. And so we could literally be ordained by the leaders of the church and have that one fulfilled. It wouldn't necessarily have to be some resurrected being or some other being like that.
This is a good point, Randy, that you're bringing up is expanding rather than narrowing possible ways to look at the way that these verses are fulfilled. For example, if we were to look at something in verse 14, understand by the little book which was eaten by John, and then the answer comes and he says, we are to understand that it was a mission, an ordinance for him to gather the tribes of Israel. Behold, this is Elias who, as it is written, must come to restore all things. And I think we've all been here where sometimes we like to narrow it so specifically that we might miss, for example, the breadth that comes in understanding the title, the role of an Elias. For example, Joseph Fielding Smith talked about it in this terms. He said, quote, "Who has restored all things? Was it one man? Certainly not. Many angelic ministrants have been sent forth from the courts of glory to confer keys and powers, to commit their dispensations and glories again to men on earth." And I like the way, as you were mentioning, is combining many ministrants. I like that word, ministrants, to bring forth the everlasting gospel.
So Moroni is an Elias
Absolutely.
in 1823 when he comes and appears to Joseph Smith, So Peter, James, and John the Baptist, all Eliases in that sense.
Even we look at a role of a Sidney Rigdon, often referred to in the Elias role of bringing forth. It's an interesting notion where if we look at it more in a broad spectrum, it really teaches our role. And then perhaps we could even apply that to our role within bringing the gospel message forward, of standing forward as part of the whole.
And I think you'll see that emphasized even more, the responsibility that as we embrace the gospel, it isn't just for us to vouchsafe it within ourselves, but we are literally to have a responsibility to share or to gather or to bring the others.
Good
there
point.
with us.
Richard?
Just to say something in relation to your point about Elias, going back to verse 9, where the prophet asked a question about who is this angel who is holding back the angels of destruction, mentioned in the book of Revelation. And the answer was Elias.
Yeah.
And Elias is this composite title of those who would participate in the restoration. And it seems that what the Lord is telling the prophet there is that the final destructions can't take place until the restoration has been completed. In other words, like he said in the New Testament, let the wheat and the tares grow together, but let the wheat grow and mature, and then there can be the separation of the wheat from the tares. But it's interesting how all this ties in together.
Oh, well said. Let's look finally at verse 15. What is to be understood by two witnesses in the 11th chapter of Revelation? And of course, these are those who would lie in the streets in Jerusalem to be raised. And sometimes, I don't know if you ever do this, wish you had a nickel for every time you heard something. And this for me is one of those of every time I heard someone who has been called and they're going to be one of those two that will lie in the streets. And
Well, with the number of missionary prep kids that I teach, I hear that all the time. I wonder what I can do to be one of those. And I think it's, one of you brethren have a quote on that I think was interesting. Was that you, Matt, that had a quote there by
I do.
Bruce R. McConkie?
Yeah, and I think that the quote on this is important. At least it frames the way that we can look at this. Is when we look at it, it says in the answer in verse 15, they are to prophets that are to be raised up to the Jewish nation in the last days. And Elder McConkie said, quote, "No doubt they will be members of the Council of the 12 or the first presidency of the church. Their prophetic ministry to the rebellious Jewry shall come in the same length as was our Lord's personal ministry among their rebellious forebears," close quote. And so what he does is he's framing it. This isn't just some run-of-the-mill, not that our missionaries are run-of-the-mill by any means, but this is a specific duty and quite a prophetic experience here. Other thoughts on that, Craig?
Well, the only ones that I know that we sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators are the
Right.
quorum of the 12 and the first presidency.
That's right.
And so that the Lord recognized them as his representatives and prophets on the earth today.
Good point. Well, brethren, let's jump over to section 78. We look at this as being framed in March of 1832, and once again, as with so many of the 1832 sections in Hiram, Ohio. And here we start to talk about principles of consecration and practices of consecration. This isn't the first time we've been with this in the Doctrine and Covenants. We see it in section 42 and throughout, and we're building up here. Craig, will you just give some thought on this and frame a little bit of what's happening here so that we have a way to compare this with what's happening historically in section 78?
Oh, yeah, sure. With the law of consecration being given in section 42, and then Joseph Smith establishing it in his first visit down to Missouri, and Bishop Partridge, is administering it down there, there becomes a need for an order, a quorum of individuals brought together to administer the laws of consecration. So there is a difference between the principles of consecration, which the members of the church are adhering to, but then there needs to be the leaders who are responsible, who hold title to the deeds and land of the church and the storehouses and administer it. This section is the organization of the United Order.
Well, you see that in verse 3, for example, section 78, verse 3. "For verily I say unto you, the time is come, and is now at hand, and behold, and lo, it must needs be that there be an organization of my people in regulating," etc. So there's that order.
My house is a house of order.
That's right, an organization. And it comes down in the last line there, both in this place and in the land of Zion.
Kirtland and Zion.
Correct, and having that continuity between the two. And so we see that almost the practice of the principle of consecration being outlined here. Any value in bringing up, at least for clarification, often when we talk about that order, names like United Order come into play, just briefly to frame that, to put it in context?
Quite often, members of the church, when they hear the phrase United Order, and it's been used by leaders as synonymous with the law of consecration itself, but here we're just seeing that there's a further organization, and this name here is given to this group of leaders that Craig was talking about.
And not to mistake the United Order with the literary firm, which was organized to be over the revelations that would be published.
Right.
But again, a group of men who had the responsibility to carry out a task.
Good. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we study through, is that there is, once again, a practice, the way that we carry that out. Unfortunately, sometimes we focus more on the practice and miss some of the grand principles that are coming forth. And so some people say, well, we don't practice it in this form any longer, so we might as well just skip section 78, or which would be a tragedy in truth. So let's take a look and go back into section 78 of some of the things that are happening here. For example, in verse 4, it says here that there is a permanent and everlasting establishment and order unto my church. Why? To advance the cause for which ye have espoused. Why? To the salvation of man and to the glory of our Father. Principally, that is an everlasting and a permanent part of the order of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for those principles there.
And in essence, that one will never change. And in order to get to the point where we are exaltable beings, he goes on to say that you may be equal in the bonds of heavenly things, yea, and earthly things also for obtaining the heavenly things. For if you are not equal in earthly things, you cannot be equal in obtaining heavenly things. And then if you want a place in the celestial kingdom, I'm going to establish the rules, and sometime or another we're going to have to learn to come up to that standard in order to achieve it.
You know, I think that that's an interesting thing you should read from verses 5 and 6, because that sure is a different at least conception of what equality is from our general view in the world today to the way the Lord is looking at this. And he does such a nice job. We see that also, the notion of equality in section 82 in verse 17, where he says, no, look, this is what I mean by equality, setting things in order according to his perspective with his eyes.
Not necessarily equality in one for one, acre for acre, or
Same for identical,
same.
yeah.
It's not that. It's the opportunity of equality, that all have the opportunity to contribute to the law of consecration and the building up of Zion. And so it's important to consider the equality issue, yeah.
You know, and I think an interesting part is I remember a quote from Elder Bowen, Albert Bowen, when he was speaking about the welfare, the church welfare plan, saying in the line of what this principally is doing is replacing inharmonious traits with the virtues and characteristics that really are in heaven, the heavenly characteristics. A practice that helps us be able to adopt heavenly principles in our lives. And when we think of that, boy, it really is an interesting process.
Well, and he's actually brought that up in verse 8, where he says that it's expedient that all things be done unto my glory. Well, his glory is to bring to pass the immortality and the eternal life of man. And that can't be as long as we're competitive, as long as we're selfish and greedy and all of those other attributes that are associated with the natural man.
Good. Craig?
Well, the idea of in my family with my children, when it comes to equality, well, that's no fair. So-and-so received this. Well, if it's unto the glory of the Father, they understand the larger concept. Well, we might be able to take care of some of those concerns with the kids when they bring that up.
Good.
In verses 9 and 10, the Lord tells these brethren, Newell Whitney and Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, to sit in council with the saints which are in Zion. Otherwise, if they don't do that, Satan seeketh to turn their hearts away from the truth, that they might become blinded and understand not the things which are prepared for them. Well, the things that are prepared for them in verse 50, that you may come up into the crowns prepared for you. And so he's talking again about exaltation, and he's saying this is just as applicable in families and in marriages as it would be under the law of consecration, where he says, if you don't sit together in counsel as husband and wives, and with your children as they're old enough to reason, that gives ample opportunity for the adversary to drive wedges between, and his policy has always been divide and destroy.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because once again, this is the notion of getting lost in a practice and missing a principle. Some might say, well, this doesn't apply to families and marriages, but principally, principles of truth applies across the board in so many wonderful ways. And when you talked a little bit about the notion of, in verse 10, blinded and understand not the things, look in verse 12 in the last line there, they will be delivered over to the buffetings of Satan until the day of redemption. And then we come back to 11, is there any hope? And the hope comes in verse 11. He says, prepare, organize yourself, and then, I love this part, by a bond or everlasting covenant that cannot be broken, and he who breaketh it shall lose his office and standing in the church, and shall be delivered over. Saying, there is a power here that we're seeing manifest in covenants. And when we talk about consecration, the covenantal power of consecration, of stewardships, we'll be talking about principles of temple and priesthood, all through covenants and keeping us on the straight course.
The antecedent of the word "it" in verse 12 is the covenant that these saints are going to make in Zion of consecration. And so it's important for Joseph's day, and it's the same for us in our day. Our covenant that we make of consecration, our temple covenants, it's in force today. And if we don't keep them, turned over to the buffetings of Satan.
And that's good. And 13 says, prepare, lay a foundation. And in verse 14 it says, why? So that you may, I like this part, that the church may stand independent above all things beneath the celestial world. So in our priority order here, we have all heavenly things is the only thing that stands above us, and all things of the world are beneath us. And what a wonderful priority that is, to teach us, seek ye first.
So the idea of temporal things, the church doesn't want to be encumbered or reliant on things of the world, programs, or, we want to, the church is self-sufficient in that. We take care of our own within welfare system of the church. It's a kingdom of Zion established for its saints.
And it's very difficult to understand this. Let's go to verse 17. Randy, we were talking a little bit about this in the notion. I think this is a real beautiful verse here that gives a concept of of almost bringing this to a whole here of, oh, I wish you could really just see what's happening here.
And I think that's what the Lord is doing, is encouraging these people. And in verse 14, he said, through my providence, notwithstanding the tribulations that shall depend. In other words, descend upon you. And it isn't a matter of everything's going to be smooth sailing. And then he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, ye are little children. Ye have not as yet understood how great blessing the Father hath in his own hands and prepared for you. And then he goes on to say, look, you cannot bear all things now. You're not going to be perfect here in mortality. Nevertheless, in spite of that, be of good cheer, for I will lead you along in spite of our imperfections. There's got to be just some interesting things saying, the Lord says, in spite of your weaknesses, I'm not going to cast you off.
Well, the idea that children need to be led along is the concept here. And in Joseph's day, these early saints with the law of consecration, they needed to be led along in how to live it, how to proceed with it, and the purpose of it. And so little children is a nice way to consider.
Well, and then that notion of being led along, we're short on time, so let's take a look at section 79 of an experience with missionary work, of being led along, teaching experience with Jared Carter. Craig, we're brief on time, but why don't you frame this just quickly and we'll just jump right in.
Well, Jared Carter's called on his second mission here. He had served a mission previously in September of 1831 to February of 32. He's had a marvelous experience out there. And so he's been called to go back to his homeland where he had grown up and preached the gospel.
But he was also told to go forth in the power of his ordination.
This is in verse 1.
In verse 1, teaching the everlasting gospel. And he says the Comforter will teach him the truth and the way he should go. So when we're called to an office or something there, it's always beyond our grasp. The Lord says, if you'll just accept the power of the ordination, then I'll send the Comforter that will teach you the truth that comes from heaven and the direction that you should go.
And the Comforter will also teach those whom the missionary is teaching.
Absolutely.
And they will bring forth wonderful sheaves. Well, brethren, thank you so much for your insights. As always, we wish we had more time. And where do we stop in studying the words of the Lord? But
We don't.
I guess we don't. That's right, Richard, is we don't, and we are taught by the Comforter whither we shall go. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Visit our website to find out more about the Doctrine and Covenants. Go to byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.